Martha Jefferson stood at Monticello's second-floor window, her hand pressed against cold glass. Down below, along the garden path that led toward the slave quarters, she watched her husband walk beside a young woman whose belly had begun to show beneath her simple cotton dress. Thomas didn't touch her, didn't look at her directly, but there was something in the careful distance he kept. Exactly 3 feet. She had measured it over weeks of watching. That told Martha everything she needed to know. She had suspected for months the way Sally Hemings moved through the house with a new kind of quiet confidence. The way Thomas's eyes would follow her when he thought no one was watching. The way conversations would stop when Martha entered a room. The way Sally's dresses had been let out twice in as many months, the seams carefully hidden but visible to someone who knew what to look for. But suspicion and certainty are different creatures entirely. Martha's reflection in the window looked back at her. Pale, thin, worn down by 6 pregnancies, and the constant pain in her chest the doctors couldn't explain. She was 33 years old and looked 50. Sally Hemings was 16 and glowed with youth and health and something else. Something that should have belonged to Martha alone. The glass fogged with her breath. When it cleared, Thomas and Sally had disappeared around the corner of the dependencies. Martha stood there for another hour, watching the empty path until the sun began to set and the shadows grew long across the Virginia hills. That night, she began writing letters. Letters she would never send. Letters that would disappear along with her, leaving behind only questions that would echo through centuries. What happened to Martha Jefferson in the spring of 1782? Why did a woman who had never left her husband's side suddenly vanish from all records for 3 crucial months? And why, when she finally reappeared, was she a completely different person? Silent, hollow, as if something essential had been carved out of her. The answers lie buried in the red clay of Virginia, in the spaces between what history recorded and what actually happened. This is the story of a wife, a slave, a founding father, and a secret so dangerous it had to be erased from every document, every letter, every memory. But secrets, like bodies, have a way of rising to the surface. If you want to hear more disturbing stories from America's hidden past, subscribe to this channel and activate the notification bell, because what you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about the men who built this nation. Monticello in early 1782 was not yet the architectural masterpiece it would become. The main house was still under construction, a work perpetually in progress that reflected Thomas Jefferson's restless mind. Exposed beams jutted from unfinished walls. Scaffolding clung to the western facade. The smell of fresh, cut timber and wet plaster permeated every room. Workers, both hired craftsmen and enslaved laborers, moved through the structure like ghosts, building the monument that would eventually imprison them all in different ways. Thomas Jefferson, then 38, had returned from his tumultuous tenure as Virginia's wartime governor to find his home half built and his wife declining in health. The Revolutionary War still raged, though the fighting had moved south. British forces under Cornwallis had invaded Virginia the previous year, forcing Jefferson to flee Richmond in what his political enemies called cowardice and his supporters called prudence. The experience had left him shaken, eager to retreat into private life and the intellectual pursuits that had always been his true passion. But private life at Monticello was anything but peaceful. Martha Wales Skelton Jefferson had married Thomas 10 years earlier, in 1772, bringing with her not only a substantial inheritance, but also 135 enslaved people from her father's estate. Among them was the Hemings family, Elizabeth Hemings and her children, including a daughter named Sally. who was just an infant then. The whispers about the Hemmings family had started long before Martha married Thomas. Everyone in Virginia society knew, though no one spoke of it openly, that Elizabeth Hemmings's children were fathered by John Wales, Martha's father, which meant that Elizabeth's daughter, Sally, was Martha's half-sister, connected by blood, but separated by the brutal mathematics of slavery. Martha had grown up with this knowledge. She had watched her father move between the main house and the slave quarters with the casual entitlement of a man who owned not just labor but bodies, futures, bloodlines. She had seen her mother's face grow tight and distant whenever Elizabeth Hemmings appeared. She had learned early that some truths were acknowledged through silence rather than speech. When Martha's mother died, John Wales had taken Elizabeth Hemmings as his concubine openly, no longer bothering with pretense. He fathered 6 more children with her. Each one was a living reminder of the system's fundamental corruption. Martha, barely a teenager, had been forced to accept these half-siblings as property, to give them orders, to participate in the fiction that blood meant nothing when it crossed the color line. She had promised herself that her own marriage would be different. That Thomas, with his enlightened ideas about liberty and human dignity, would never replicate her father's behavior. She had been wrong. The plantation operated with the brutal efficiency common to Virginia estates of the period. Nearly 200 enslaved people worked the tobacco fields, the vegetable gardens, the nail factory, the textile workshop, and the house itself. They built the walls that would imprison them. They cooked the food for tables they would never sit at. They raised children who would never be their own. They created wealth they would never benefit from, building an empire of ideas about freedom on a foundation of bondage. Thomas Jefferson kept meticulous records of everything: crop yields, weather patterns, construction progress, the births and deaths of enslaved people, tracked with the same attention he gave to his garden vegetables. His journals from this period survive in various archives, thousands of pages of careful observations about soil composition and architectural theory and philosophical musings on liberty and the pursuit of happiness. But from March through May of 1782, there are only blank pages. 12 weeks of silence in a record that was otherwise obsessively complete. 12 weeks that Thomas Jefferson wanted erased from history. Martha had given birth to their 6th child, Lucy Elizabeth, in May of 1781. The delivery had been difficult, complicated by Martha's weakened constitution and the primitive medical care available even to wealthy families. The doctor had used forceps, causing internal injuries that never properly healed. Martha hemorrhaged for weeks afterward, losing so much blood that she couldn't stand without fainting. She survived, but she never recovered. She spent most days in bed, too weak to walk more than a few steps without assistance. The pain in her abdomen was constant, a dull ache that sharpened into agony whenever she moved. The doctors came and went, a parade of men with confident diagnoses and useless treatments. They prescribed laudanum for the pain, which helped but left her mind foggy and disconnected. They prescribed bloodletting for the weakness, which only made her weaker. They prescribed bed rest and fresh air and various tonics that tasted like poison and probably were. Nothing helped. Martha was dying slowly, and everyone knew it. Thomas hired additional house servants to care for her. Sally Hemings, who had just turned 15, was brought up from the weaving house where she had been learning textile work. She was assigned light duties, bringing meals to Martha's room, changing linens, reading aloud when Martha's eyes grew too tired, sitting quietly in case Martha needed anything. Sally was unusually beautiful, with light skin inherited from her white father, and delicate features that made visitors mistake her for a member of the family rather than property. She had hazel eyes, unusual in the slave quarters, and hair that fell in soft waves rather than tight curls. She was also intelligent, quick to learn, observant in a way that made some people uncomfortable. She could read, a skill Elizabeth Hemings had secretly taught her children despite the laws against slave literacy. She could play the harpsichord, having learned by listening to Martha's lessons and practicing when the family was away. Martha, in her illness, grew attached to the girl. Sally reminded her of herself at that age, before marriage, before children, before the slow erosion of hope that comes from loving a man who loves ideas more than people. She taught Sally French, reading to her from Voltaire and Rousseau, enjoying the irony of teaching Enlightenment philosophy to a girl who had no rights at all. They would sit together for hours, Martha in her bed and Sally in a chair beside it, discussing ideas that both of them knew would never change, Sally's fundamental status as property. But Thomas saw something different in Sally, something that would destroy everything. It began in February of 1782, during one of the coldest winters Virginia had seen in decades. Ice formed on the inside of windows, creating crystalline patterns that looked like frozen flowers. The James River froze solid for the first time in living memory, thick enough that people walked across it. The enslaved people in the quarters burned through their meager wood supplies in the first 2 weeks and spent the rest of the winter huddled together for warmth, wearing every piece of clothing they owned. 3 children died of pneumonia in a single week. Their bodies were buried in ground so frozen that the grave diggers had to light fires to soften the earth enough to dig. Martha's condition worsened with the cold. She could no longer leave her bed at all. Her skin took on a gray pallor that made her look like she was already dead. Her breathing became labored, each breath a visible effort. She coughed constantly, bringing up blood that stained her handkerchiefs. The doctors said it was consumption, though they couldn't explain why the usual treatments had no effect. They began to speak in hushed tones about making her comfortable, about preparing the family for the inevitable. Thomas spent his days in his study, supposedly working on revisions to the Virginia legal code. He had been asked to reform the state's laws to bring them in line with Republican principles. It was work that should have consumed him, the kind of intellectual challenge he normally relished. But the house servants noticed that he seemed distracted, that pages sat on his desk for days without being touched, that he stared out the window for hours at a time. They also noticed that Sally Hemings was often sent to bring him tea, to stoke his fire, to deliver messages that could have been delivered by anyone, and they noticed that these errands took longer than they should. Sally would disappear into the study with a tea tray and not emerge for an hour. The door would be closed. No sounds would come from within, and when Sally finally emerged, her face would be flushed, her hair slightly disheveled, her eyes carefully avoiding everyone else's gaze. The other house servants began to whisper. Betty Brown, who had served the Jefferson family for 20 years, told her daughter that she had seen Thomas touch Sally's hand when she brought him tea. A lingering touch that went beyond courtesy. Ursula, the cook, said she had heard voices from the study late at night, Thomas's low murmur and Sally's softer responses. Martin Hemings, Sally's brother and Thomas's personal servant, said nothing. But his face grew tight and angry whenever Sally's name was mentioned. Martha noticed too. Even through the fog of laudanum, she saw the way Thomas looked at Sally. She heard the footsteps in the hallway late at night, the soft closing of doors, the whispered conversations that stopped when she called out. She noticed that Sally had new dresses, better fabric than the other house servants wore. She noticed that Sally was excused from the hardest work, that she was given privileges that created resentment among the other enslaved people. And she noticed, with a sick certainty that cut through the laudanum haze, that Sally's body was changing. The girl's breasts were fuller. Her face had a certain glow. Her dresses were being let out at the waist. Sally Hemings was pregnant. In early March, Martha summoned her sister, Elizabeth Epps, to Monticello. The message was urgent, carried by a rider through freezing rain. Elizabeth arrived 2 days later to find Martha in a state of agitation unusual for someone so ill. Martha was sitting up in bed, her eyes bright with fever, or fury, or both. She had refused her laudanum that morning, wanting her mind clear. Martha dismissed the servants and spoke to her sister in urgent whispers for over an hour. The door was closed, but Betty Brown, who was cleaning in the hallway, heard fragments of the conversation. She heard Martha say, "Pregnant. In my own house. My father's daughter." She heard Elizabeth's shocked responses, her attempts to calm Martha, her suggestions that Martha might be mistaken. But Martha was not mistaken. She had evidence. She had been watching, documenting, keeping track of dates and times and observations in a small journal. She kept hidden beneath her mattress. She had recorded every time Sally went to Thomas's study, every time Thomas visited the slave quarters at night, every time Sally's dresses were altered. She had calculated the dates and determined that Sally was approximately 3 months pregnant, and she had a plan. No record exists of what exactly Martha told her sister that day. But Elizabeth left Monticello that same afternoon, her face pale and drawn, and she never spoke of the visit to anyone. She rode away in the rain, and she did not look back at the house. 2 days later, Sally Hemings appeared at breakfast with a bruise on her cheek, dark purple spreading from her cheekbone to her jaw. When Betty Brown asked what happened, Sally said she had fallen on the ice. But there was no ice in the house, and Sally's eyes told a different story. They were red from crying, and they held a fear that went beyond physical pain. That night, Martha Jefferson left her bed for the first time in weeks. Several servants saw her walking through the house in her nightgown, carrying a candle, moving with surprising strength for someone supposedly dying. Her face was set in an expression of grim determination. She went to Thomas's study. The door closed. Voices were raised. Martha's high and sharp, cutting through the walls, Thomas's low and defensive, trying to calm her. The argument lasted over an hour. Servants gathered in the hallways, pretending to work while straining to hear. They caught fragments. "Your own house. My father's child. Everyone will know. Destroy everything." Then silence. A long, terrible silence that was somehow worse than the shouting. When the door finally opened, Thomas emerged alone. His face was composed, carefully neutral, but his hands were shaking. He ordered all the servants to bed immediately, his voice cold, brooking no argument. The servants scattered, but they watched from windows and doorways as Thomas locked himself in his study for the rest of the night. A single candle burned in the window until dawn. The next morning, Martha Jefferson was gone. Thomas gathered the household staff in the main hall at sunrise. His face was haggard, his eyes red from lack of sleep, but his voice was steady. He announced that Martha had been taken to a specialist doctor in Richmond during the night. Her condition had deteriorated suddenly, he explained, and she required treatment that could only be provided in the city. She would be gone for several weeks, possibly months. In the meantime, the household was to continue operating normally. No one was to discuss Martha's absence with visitors. Anyone who spread rumors would be severely punished. The servants listened in silence. They knew better than to ask questions, but they also knew the story made no sense. First, Martha was far too ill to travel. The journey to Richmond was over 70 miles on rough roads, a trip that would take 3 days minimum in good weather. In March, with the roads muddy from rain and snow, it could take a week. The constant jostling of the carriage, the exposure to cold and damp, the lack of proper rest. Any of these things could easily kill someone in Martha's condition. No doctor would recommend such a journey. No husband who cared about his wife's survival would allow it. Second, if Martha had truly been taken to Richmond, there would have been preparation. Trunks packed with her belongings, arrangements made for her care, messages sent ahead to secure lodging and alert the doctor. But none of this had happened. Martha's room looked exactly as it had the night before. Her clothes still in the wardrobe, her personal items still on the dressing table. If she had left for an extended stay in Richmond, she had taken nothing with her. Third, Thomas made no attempt to visit her. For a man supposedly devoted to his dying wife, he showed remarkable indifference to her treatment. He remained at Monticello, overseeing construction, managing the plantation, and spending an unusual amount of time in the slave quarters. He sent no letters to Richmond asking about Martha's condition. He received no updates from the supposed doctor. He acted like a man who knew exactly where his wife was and had no concerns about her well-being. The enslaved community at Monticello had their own theories about what happened. These theories were passed down through generations, whispered in the quarters late at night, never written down but never forgotten. They were shared in the careful code that enslaved people developed for discussing dangerous truths. Oblique references, meaningful silences, stories that seemed to be about other people, but were really about the masters. They said Martha had discovered the truth about Thomas and Sally. They said she had confronted him with evidence that could destroy his reputation. A man who wrote about liberty while forcing himself on an enslaved girl who was his wife's half-sister. They said Thomas had been forced to choose between his reputation and his wife. And they said he had chosen his reputation. But where was Martha? If she hadn't gone to Richmond, where had she been taken? And why did Thomas go to such lengths to conceal her location? The answer lay in a place that no longer appears on any map, a place that was deliberately erased from history along with Martha herself. Approximately 30 miles west of Monticello, deep in the mountains that formed the spine of Virginia, there was a small settlement called Shadwell Mills. It had been founded by Peter Jefferson, Thomas's father, in the 1740s as a commercial venture. The settlement consisted of a grist mill powered by a fast-moving creek, a few outbuildings for storage and equipment, and a stone house set back from the road on a small rise. The house was substantial, built to last, with thick walls of local fieldstone and a slate roof that could withstand the harsh mountain winters. It had been intended as a residence for the mill manager, but the mill had never been profitable. The settlement was too remote, too difficult to reach, too far from the main trade routes. By 1760, the mill had been abandoned. The outbuildings fell into disrepair. The stone house stood empty, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Thomas inherited the property when his father died, but he rarely visited it. The house was isolated, surrounded by dense forest, accessible only by a narrow path that was often impossible in winter and spring. There were no neighbors within 5 miles. The nearest town was a 2-day ride away. It was the kind of place where a person could disappear completely, where screams would be swallowed by the forest, where no one would ever know what happened behind those thick stone walls. In March of 1782, Smoke was seen rising from the stone house's chimney for the first time in years. A local hunter named William Crawford, tracking deer through the mountains, noticed it and thought it strange. He approached cautiously and saw that the house had been recently occupied. The windows had been shuttered from the inside. Fresh firewood was stacked by the door. A carriage stood in what had once been a yard, now overgrown with weeds. Crawford watched from the tree line for over an hour. He saw two enslaved men from Monticello. He recognized them from having sold game to the plantation, carrying supplies into the house, water from the creek, firewood, a basket that looked like it contained food. They moved with the careful efficiency of men performing an unpleasant duty. Their faces set in expressions of grim determination. Then Crawford heard something that made his blood run cold. A woman's voice, high and desperate, screaming from inside the house. The words were indistinct, but the anguish was unmistakable. The scream went on and on, rising in pitch until it cut off abruptly, as if someone had covered the woman's mouth. The two enslaved men stopped what they were doing. They looked at each other, their faces carefully blank. Then they finished unloading the supplies and left, driving the carriage back down the narrow path toward Monticello. Crawford waited until they were gone, then approached the house. He tried to look through the shuttered windows, but they were sealed tight. He tried the door, but it was locked from the outside. A heavy padlock that would require a key to open. He called out, asking if anyone needed help, but received no response. He rode into the nearest town and mentioned what he had seen to a friend at the tavern. The friend, a man named Robert Hughes, who had business dealings with Jefferson, told Crawford that he must have been mistaken. There was no one at Shadwell Mills. The property had been abandoned for years. Perhaps Crawford had seen squatters, or perhaps the isolation of the mountains had played tricks on his mind. But Crawford knew what he had seen, and he knew what he had heard. A woman was being held in that stone house against her will, and everyone seemed determined to pretend it wasn't happening. Within a week, rumors were spreading through Albemarle County. People whispered that Thomas Jefferson was keeping his wife prisoner in the mountains. They said Martha had gone mad and had to be restrained for her own safety. They said she had tried to kill herself and was being prevented from trying again. They said she had discovered something about Thomas that he couldn't allow her to reveal. Thomas moved quickly to suppress the rumors. He visited Robert Hughes personally and suggested that spreading false stories about a governor's family could be considered sedition. A serious crime in wartime Virginia. See you in the next video.